Sheriff Thomas Beckett stared at the child sitting across from him in the sparse office of the Galveston County Courthouse. The girl couldn't have been more than 9 years old, dressed in the plain cotton dress typical of enslaved children throughout Texas in 1854. But when she opened her mouth, what came out shattered everything he thought he understood about the peculiar institution that had defined his state since its inception. "Je ne comprends pas ce que vous dites, monsieur," the girl said, her French as flawless and refined as any Parisian aristocrat's daughter. Beckett looked at the plantation owner who had brought her in, a man named Richard Hartley, whose face showed equal parts confusion and rage. "She won't speak English," Hartley said, his voice tight. "Not one word. I bought her 3 weeks ago at auction in Houston, and she hasn't spoken anything but French since. Perfect French." The auctioneer swore she was from a plantation in East Texas, born and raised here. No connection to Louisiana, no French parentage that anyone knows of. This wasn't the first time Sheriff Beckett had encountered this phenomenon. Over the past 2 years, he'd heard whispers from across Texas, enslaved children, always between the ages of 6 and 12, who spoke only French, despite having been born on American soil to parents who knew no French at all. The pattern was impossible to ignore, yet equally impossible to explain through conventional means. "How many does this make now?" asked Deputy Marshal James Crawford, who'd been listening from the doorway. 7, Beckett replied quietly. 7 children in 2 years, all from different counties across Texas. All speaking perfect French, and according to everyone who's encountered them, all raised in exactly the same peculiar manner. What the sheriff didn't say, what he couldn't yet prove, was that each of these children had vanished from their original plantations before the age of 4, only to reappear years later at slave auctions across the state with no memory of their early years and an inexplicable mastery of a foreign tongue. Someone, somewhere in Texas, was taking these children. And whatever was being done to them during those missing years had begun to draw attention from forces far more dangerous than curious lawmen. The question that would haunt Sheriff Beckett through the summer of 1854 wasn't just who was taking the children, or why. It was what happened during those lost years that transformed ordinary enslaved children into something that defied every assumption about identity, memory, and the very nature of human development. And as he would soon discover, the answer lay hidden in plain sight, protected by the one thing that made it nearly impossible to investigate: the institution of slavery itself. The first documented case reached Sheriff Beckett's attention in the spring of 1852, though he wouldn't recognize it as part of a pattern until much later. A cotton planter from Fort Bend County named William Garrison had purchased an 8-year-old boy at a Houston slave market. The boy appeared healthy and strong, and the seller, a trader from East Texas named Marcus Webb, had assured Garrison that the child was American-born, docile, and already trained for field work despite his young age. The price was reasonable, slightly below market value, which Garrison attributed to the boy's small stature. Within 3 days of arriving at Garrison's plantation, the household was in chaos. The boy refused to respond to English commands. When the overseer tried to place him with other children in the cotton fields, the boy spoke rapidly in what several workers recognized as French, though none could understand the specific words. He seemed terrified, disoriented, and completely unable or unwilling to communicate in English. Garrison, who'd served briefly in the Mexican-American War and had some exposure to educated officers, recognized the boy's French as remarkably sophisticated. This wasn't the Creole patois he'd heard in New Orleans or the rough frontier French of some Louisiana territories. This was the refined French of educated Europeans, spoken with the precision of someone who'd been thoroughly instructed in the language from early childhood. "The boy speaks like a French diplomat's son," Garrison told Sheriff Beckett when he brought the matter to local authorities, demanding either an explanation or a refund from the trader. But according to Webb's papers, this child was born on a plantation in Cherokee County to parents who were both field workers. Neither parent spoke anything but English. How does a child like that come to speak French like he's been raised in a Parisian salon? Beckett had made inquiries. The bill of sale was legitimate, properly notarized and registered. The trader, Marcus Webb, was known throughout East Texas as a reliable dealer who handled the sale of enslaved people from estates and smaller plantations. Webb himself seemed as confused as Garrison when questioned. "I bought the boy from a settlement sale in Nacogdoches," Webb had explained, showing his own purchase records. The previous owner was a widow liquidating her late husband's property. She told me the boy had been born on their land, raised there until he was about 7. Then he got sold to pay some debts. I never heard him speak a word of French when I had him. He was quiet, but he followed instructions in English just fine. The trail went cold there. The widow had since died, and her property records showed only that she'd purchased the boy at age 4 from yet another trader, whose records were incomplete. The boy's origins became impossible to trace beyond fragmented bills of sale that contradicted each other about his birthplace, parentage, and early years. Eventually, Garrison kept the boy and hired a French-speaking merchant from Galveston to come teach him English. It took months, but gradually the child began to understand and speak English, though he never explained why he'd arrived speaking only French. When pressed, the boy seemed genuinely confused, as though he couldn't quite remember anything before waking up in the trader's pen. Beckett had filed the incident away as a bizarre anomaly, perhaps the result of some confused record-keeping or a child who'd been moved through Louisiana territories during his early years. But then, 6 months later, it happened again. Martha Keene was a widow who ran a modest boarding house in Austin. In the autumn of 1852, she purchased a 10-year-old girl to help with kitchen work and cleaning. The purchase was conducted through a local broker who specialized in placing domestic workers with respectable families. The girl arrived on a Tuesday morning, and by Tuesday evening Martha Keene was in the office of a magistrate demanding answers. "She won't speak English," Keene said, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and fear. "Not one word. She speaks French, beautiful, proper French. I studied French at a finishing school in Virginia before I married, and I can tell you this child speaks better than my instructors did. How is this possible?" The broker swore she was Texas-born, from a farm in Washington County. He showed me papers proving her lineage going back 2 generations, all Texas residents. The magistrate, Judge Henry Morton, had listened patiently and then done something unusual. Instead of dismissing it as a simple case of fraudulent sale, he began investigating. Morton was an educated man who'd practiced law in Tennessee before moving to Texas, and the case intrigued him intellectually. What he discovered troubled him enough that he wrote a letter to Sheriff Beckett in Galveston, knowing the sheriff's reputation for thoroughness in unusual cases. According to Morton's investigation, the girl had indeed been born in Washington County on a small farm owned by a family named Sutton. The Suttons had raised her from birth until she was approximately 3 years old. Then, according to their records, she'd been sold to pay off a gambling debt incurred by the family's eldest son. The purchaser had been a man named Daniel Foster, who claimed to represent a plantation in Brazoria County. Foster's own records, however, showed no such plantation. The address he'd provided led to an abandoned property. Foster himself had disappeared from all records after that single transaction. The girl vanished from all documentation for nearly 4 years. Then she reappeared at a slave auction in Bastrop County, sold by a trader who claimed she'd come from an estate sale in East Texas. No records explained where she'd been or how she'd come to speak fluent French. "There's something else," Morton wrote to Beckett. "I interviewed the Suttons, the family that originally owned the girl. They remembered her as a normal child, spoke English, no exposure to French, no unusual circumstances. They were shocked to learn what had become of her. But here's what disturbed me most. They said the man who purchased her, this Daniel Foster, specifically requested a child of that age. He came to their farm asking if they had any children between 3 and 4 years old available for purchase. He wasn't interested in adults, wasn't interested in older children, just that specific age range, and he paid well above market value." Beckett had felt the first stirrings of genuine concern when he read Morton's letter. 1 French-speaking child could be explained away. 2 suggested a pattern, and the detail about the buyer specifically requesting a young child of a particular age. That suggested intention, planning. He wrote back to Morton, asking him to document everything about the case and to notify Beckett immediately if he heard of any similar situations. Then Beckett began making his own inquiries among the network of sheriffs, marshals, and magistrates across Texas. What emerged over the following months was deeply disturbing. By early 1853, Sheriff Beckett had collected reports of 5 cases spanning from Houston to Austin, from Galveston to small towns in East Texas near the Louisiana border. In each case, the pattern was identical. An enslaved child between the ages of 6 and 10 appeared at a slave auction or was sold through a broker. The child spoke only French, refined, educated French that seemed impossible given their documented backgrounds. Attempts to trace their origins led to a confusing maze of bills of sale and property transfers, but in each case, there was a gap of 3 to 5 years in the documentation where the children simply disappeared from all records. More disturbing was what Beckett discovered when he managed to interview 3 of the children through French-speaking interpreters. All 3 told similar stories, though their accounts were fragmented and confused, like trying to remember a half-forgotten dream. They recalled being taken to a place they described as the house with many rooms. They spoke of lessons, hours each day devoted to learning French, to reading and writing in French, to memorizing French poetry and songs. They described strict but not cruel treatment, adequate food, clean clothing. They mentioned other children, perhaps a dozen or more, all engaged in the same intensive education, but none of them could describe where this house was located. They couldn't recall specific landmarks, couldn't identify the adults who taught them. Their memories of those years existed in a strange, isolated bubble, disconnected from any sense of geography or specific identity. C'était comme un rêve, one girl told the interpreter. It was like a dream. When asked why they'd been taken, why they'd been taught French, the children had no answers. When asked if they'd been told what would happen to them after their education was complete, they shook their heads. The lessons simply stopped one day, and they found themselves in a trader's pen, waiting to be sold. Beckett shared his findings with Judge Morton and with Deputy Marshal Crawford, who'd become equally invested in solving the mystery. Together they began to form theories. Someone is taking young enslaved children and educating them in French, Crawford said, laying out the facts as they understood them. They're keeping these children for several years, then returning them to the slave market. The question is why? What's the purpose? And why haven't the original owners raised alarms about missing children? Morton added. That's what troubles me most. In every case, the children were legally sold before they vanished. Someone is buying them legitimately, then what? Training them. But for what purpose? Beckett had been thinking about this question for months. He'd considered and dismissed various theories. Was this some elaborate scheme to create educated servants for wealthy French-speaking families? But that made no sense. Why go through such elaborate subterfuge? Why not simply hire French tutors and educate the children openly? Was it connected to the Underground Railroad, some abolitionist plot to educate enslaved children? But that didn't fit either. The children weren't being freed. They were being returned to slavery, often in worse circumstances than before, since their inability to speak English made them difficult to place and work with. There's another pattern I've noticed, Beckett said, pulling out a map of Texas he'd marked with the locations of each incident. Look at where these children were originally taken from before they vanished. Morton and Crawford studied the map. The locations formed a rough circle in central and eastern Texas, spanning several counties, but centered around a region about 80 miles northwest of Houston. And look at where they reappeared. Beckett continued, marking different locations in red. They show up at auctions and broker houses all over Texas, but never in the same areas they were taken from. Someone is deliberately moving them far from their points of origin. To prevent recognition, Crawford said slowly. If they returned to nearby areas, someone might recognize them. Parents, former owners, other enslaved people who knew them as children. Exactly, Beckett confirmed. Whoever is doing this is being very careful to ensure these children can't be connected to their pasts. Before they could discuss the implications further, a messenger arrived at the courthouse with an urgent summons. A plantation owner from Waller County had just arrived in Galveston with 2 children, both speaking only French, both purchased within the past month from different traders. For the first time, Beckett would have a chance to interview multiple children together, and what he learned would force him to confront a truth more disturbing than any of his theories had suggested. The plantation owner was a man named Robert Thornton, whose large cotton operation north of Houston had made him wealthy enough to be both influential and demanding. He'd paid good money for 2 young workers and was furious to discover they were, in his words, defective goods. I want refunds, I want compensation, and I want whoever is perpetrating this fraud arrested and prosecuted, Thornton announced when he stormed into Beckett's office. This is deliberate deception, and it's costing honest businessmen considerable money. Beckett ignored Thornton's bluster and focused on the children. A boy of about 9 and a girl perhaps 7 years old, both standing quietly with the resignation of those who'd learned early that drawing attention was dangerous. He'd arranged for a French-speaking merchant named Philippe Rousseau to serve as interpreter. Rousseau was a transplant from Louisiana who'd established a successful import business in Galveston and had helped Beckett in previous interviews. Ask them their names, Beckett instructed. Rousseau spoke to the children in gentle French. After a moment's hesitation, the boy responded, "Je m'appelle Thomas." The girl added, "Louise." Ask them where they learned to speak French. The answer was the same as all the others. The house with many rooms, the lessons that filled their days, the other children. But this time, when Rousseau pressed for details, something different emerged. "Monsieur Laurent," the boy said suddenly. "C'était Monsieur Laurent qui nous enseignait. He says a Monsieur Laurent taught them," Rousseau translated, his eyes widening. "He's giving us a name." Beckett leaned forward. "Ask him to describe this Monsieur Laurent." The boy's description, translated carefully by Rousseau, painted a picture of a middle-aged man, tall and thin, who spoke French with what the boy called the proper accent. Laurent dressed formally, always in dark suits, and conducted the lessons with strict but fair discipline. He rarely smiled but wasn't cruel. He seemed educated, refined, and utterly dedicated to the children's instruction. Ask him if there were other teachers. "Oui, Madame Dubois. Elle nous apprenait à lire et à écrire." A Madame Dubois who taught reading and writing. The girl added another name, Mademoiselle Claire, who taught them French songs and poetry. For the first time, Beckett had specific names. It wasn't much, but it was more than he'd had before. Ask them if they remember how they came to be at this house, Beckett said. The children's answers were frustratingly vague. They remembered being taken somewhere by a man they didn't know, a journey in a covered wagon, arriving at a large house surrounded by trees. They couldn't describe the route or identify any landmarks. Their memories began in earnest only after they arrived at the house and the lessons began. Ask them what happened when the lessons ended. The girl spoke this time, her voice small but clear. "Un jour, Monsieur Laurent nous a dit que notre éducation était complète. Il a dit que nous allions à de nouvelles maisons. Puis nous avons été emmenés au marché." She says one day, Monsieur Laurent told them their education was complete, Rousseau translated. He said they were going to new homes, then they were taken to the market. Did he explain why they'd been educated? Beckett pressed. Did he tell them what they were being prepared for? Both children shook their heads. The purpose of their education had never been explained to them. They'd been taken, taught, and returned to slavery without ever understanding why. After the interview concluded and Thornton left, still angry but somewhat mollified by Beckett's assurance that he was investigating, the sheriff sat with Rousseau and Crawford, trying to make sense of what they'd learned. "Someone is running a school," Crawford said slowly. "A secret school for enslaved children, where they're taught French for several years and then released back into the general population. But why?" Rousseau asked, genuinely puzzled. "What possible purpose does it serve? These children become more valuable in theory, educated, multilingual, but in practice they're nearly worthless because they can't communicate with their owners." Beckett had been thinking about this, and a disturbing possibility had begun to form in his mind. What if making them valuable isn't the point? What if someone is trying to prove something? Both men looked at him, waiting for him to continue. "Think about what we're seeing," Beckett said carefully. "Enslaved children, taken from various plantations across Texas. They're educated intensively in French, not just taught to speak it, but educated in reading, writing, poetry, culture. Then they're returned to slavery. The result is children who are demonstrably intelligent and capable of complex learning, but who are treated as defective because they can't serve their basic purpose as laborers. You think this is some kind of abolitionist demonstration?" Crawford asked skeptically. "Trying to prove enslaved people can be educated?" "Perhaps," Beckett said, "or perhaps it's something more personal. What if someone is conducting an experiment, testing whether these children can retain their education even after being returned to harsh circumstances?" Rousseau looked troubled. That would be monstrous. To educate children, show them a different life, then return them to slavery just to observe what happens. "It would be," Beckett agreed grimly, "but it would explain the pattern. It would explain why someone is going to such elaborate lengths to hide the operation while still allowing the children to eventually surface where they can be observed." Before they could debate this theory further, news arrived that would change the direction of the investigation entirely. A trader in Houston had been arrested after a violent altercation at a market. During his arrest, authorities had seized his records, and those records contained references to a property in Austin County described only as the French House. For the first time, Beckett had a potential physical location, and he intended to find it. Austin County lay north of Houston, a region of rolling prairie and scattered woodlands where plantations and small farms coexisted in an uneasy patchwork of settlement. Beckett, Crawford, and 2 additional deputies made the journey in early autumn of 1853, carrying authorization from a sympathetic judge to investigate properties associated with the arrested trader. The trader, a man named Samuel Wyatt, had proven surprisingly cooperative once faced with serious charges of falsifying bills of sale. He'd admitted to serving as an intermediary in several transactions involving children from what he called the French operation, though he claimed to know little about its actual purpose or location. "I was paid to move children," Wyatt had told them. "Take them from one place, deliver them to another. Sometimes I'd pick up a child and transport them to a property in Austin County. Other times I'd collect children from that same property and move them to auctions in other counties. I never asked questions. The money was good, and I was told the operation had legal backing." "Legal backing from whom?" Beckett had demanded. "A lawyer named Beaufort," Wyatt had replied. "Andre Beaufort operates out of Houston. French fellow, been in Texas since before the Revolution. He handled all the paperwork, made sure everything was documented properly. Said it was all legitimate business." That name, Andre Beaufort, had opened up a new line of investigation, but Beckett wanted to find the physical location first. Wyatt had provided rough directions to the property. A substantial house on several hundred acres, isolated from the main roads, owned through a series of legal proxies that made the true ownership nearly impossible to determine. They found it on the 3rd day of searching, at the end of a long dirt road that wound through dense oak trees. The house was large but not ostentatious. A 2-story structure built in a style more common to Louisiana than Texas, with wide galleries and tall windows designed to catch the breeze. As they approached, Beckett felt a tension building in his chest. This place had been the subject of investigation for over a year. Here, if anywhere, they might find answers. The property appeared abandoned. No smoke rose from the chimneys, no workers moved about the grounds. The windows were shuttered, the doors locked. But the house itself was well maintained, not showing the decay that usually accompanied abandonment. "Someone still cares for this place," Crawford observed. "The grounds are trimmed, the buildings are sound. This hasn't been empty for long." They found a way inside through a rear door and entered with weapons drawn, though the silence suggested they'd find no resistance. What they discovered inside was more unsettling than any confrontation would have been. The house was furnished like a school. The main floor contained several large rooms equipped with desks, chairs arranged in rows, blackboards mounted on the walls. Books lined shelves in what appeared to be a library, dozens of French texts covering history, literature, mathematics, and science. Upstairs, they found dormitory-style sleeping quarters, small beds arranged in neat rows, each with a simple trunk at its foot. Clothing hung in wardrobes, children's clothing in various sizes, all well made and clean. In what appeared to be an administrative office, they struck gold. Ledgers and documents filled a desk and file cabinet. Beckett began examining them immediately while his deputies searched the rest of the property. The ledgers recorded a meticulous operation spanning nearly a decade. Lists of children's names, ages, dates of arrival and departure. Notes on their progress in learning French, their aptitude for different subjects, their behavior and disposition. The entries were clinical, detached, recorded in a precise hand that Beckett assumed belonged to the mysterious Monsieur Laurent. "They've been doing this since at least 1844, Beckett said, flipping through earlier pages. "Taking children, educating them for 3 to 5 years, then releasing them. Dozens of children have passed through here." But the ledgers raised as many questions as they answered. They recorded what was done, but not why. They showed a carefully managed system, but revealed nothing about its ultimate purpose. Then Crawford found something in a separate drawer, a bundle of letters tied with string. The correspondence was in French, but Rousseau, who'd accompanied them on the search, translated as they examined each letter. The letters were between 2 individuals, Andre Beaufort, the lawyer Wyatt had mentioned, and someone identified only as L, presumably Laurent. The correspondence spanned years and revealed a truth stranger than any of their theories had suggested. Beaufort's letters spoke of the project and our objective. He referenced securing funding from interested parties in France who believed in the fundamental equality of human capacity regardless of circumstances of birth. He discussed the importance of maintaining secrecy while still allowing the results to eventually become known. Laurent's responses were more philosophical. He wrote of his students' progress with evident pride, describing their accomplishments in learning French language and culture. He pondered whether their education would survive once they were returned to slavery, whether the light of knowledge, once kindled, can truly be extinguished. One letter in particular struck Beckett with its stark honesty. "We know what we do is temporary," Laurent had written. "We cannot free these children, cannot change their circumstances permanently. But we can prove what others deny, that they are as capable of learning as any European child, as worthy of education. When these children eventually speak, when their abilities are witnessed, perhaps it will force a reckoning with the lies that justify their bondage." "Dear God," Rousseau said softly as he finished translating. "They're not trying to free these children or even help them individually. They're trying to make a political point." Beckett felt a cold rage building. They're using these children as pawns in an ideological argument, educating them only to return them to slavery, hoping that their existence will somehow inspire change. "It's monstrous," Crawford said. "Even if their intentions are noble, they're treating these children as experiments rather than human beings." As they continued reading through the letters and documents, a fuller picture emerged. The operation had been funded by a group of French abolitionists who believed that demonstrating the educability of enslaved people would help undermine the intellectual justifications for slavery. They'd recruited Laurent, a former teacher from Paris who'd immigrated to Louisiana in the 1840s, to run the school. Beaufort, the Houston lawyer, had handled the logistics, arranging the purchases of young children through intermediaries, maintaining the property through proxy ownership, ensuring all documentation appeared legitimate to avoid legal complications. The children were chosen at random from various plantations, taken at young ages when they could be educated most effectively, then returned to the slave market after their education was complete. The operations leaders genuinely believed they were serving a greater good, that the presence of French-speaking, educated enslaved children throughout Texas would gradually create a cognitive dissonance that would contribute to slavery's eventual end. They saw themselves as idealists fighting against injustice. But to Beckett, reading these documents in the empty schoolhouse, it all felt like a terrible form of cruelty, disguised as compassion. These children had been given knowledge and culture only to have it stripped away, returned to circumstances where their education was worthless and even disadvantageous. They'd been taught to read and write, to appreciate poetry and philosophy, then sent to pick cotton or serve in households where such abilities meant nothing. "The last entry in the ledger is from 6 months ago," Crawford called from the next room. "It looks like they closed down the operation, sent the remaining children to auctions across the state, then emptied the house." Why would they shut down? Rousseau wondered. If they believed in their cause, why stop? Beckett found the answer in one of Beaufort's final letters. The lawyer wrote that the experiment has been compromised due to increasing attention from authorities, meaning Beckett's own investigation. He recommended ceasing operations before they could be officially exposed, trusting that the children already released would be sufficient to achieve their goals over time. There was also a more practical concern. Several of the French sponsors had withdrawn their funding, disillusioned by the project's failure to generate the transformative effects they'd hoped for. The presence of French-speaking enslaved children in Texas had created curiosity and confusion, but it hadn't sparked any meaningful challenges to the institution of slavery itself. "Where are they now?" Crawford asked. Laurent, Beaufort, the others involved. That proved harder to determine. The document suggested Laurent had returned to France. Beaufort's last letter indicated he was closing his Houston practice and leaving Texas, though his destination wasn't specified. The operation's sponsors had severed their connections, abandoning the project to its fate. "They just walked away," Beckett said bitterly. "Left these children scattered across Texas, dealing with the consequences of an education that serves no purpose except to make their lives more difficult. They spent the rest of the day documenting everything they'd found, gathering evidence for a formal report. But even as Beckett worked, he knew that pursuing legal action would be nearly impossible. The operation had been meticulously documented to appear legitimate according to the laws governing slavery. Children had been purchased legally, held legally, and sold legally. The fact that they'd been educated in French was strange but not technically illegal. And more troubling, attempting to prosecute the case would require proving that educating enslaved children constituted some form of abuse or fraud, an argument that would implicitly reinforce the very beliefs the abolitionists had been trying to challenge. Beckett found himself trapped in a bitter irony. To seek justice for these children, he would have to argue that they'd been harmed by receiving an education, that teaching them French had damaged their value as property. The law offered no framework for addressing the true cruelty of what had been done, giving these children a glimpse of learning and culture, then ensuring they could never use it. The investigation concluded in early 1854 with a detailed report submitted to Texas authorities. Beckett documented the entire operation, the school in Austin County, the network of traders and intermediaries, the French sponsors, and their abolitionist motivations. He included copies of the ledgers, the correspondence, and testimony from the children he'd interviewed. The response was bureaucratic indifference mixed with quiet relief. State officials acknowledged that an unusual situation had occurred, but determined that no laws had been definitively broken. The operation had shut down voluntarily, its leaders had left the state, and pursuing prosecution would be costly and potentially embarrassing for Texas. Best to let it fade away, one official told Beckett. The fewer people who know the details, the better. Can you imagine the reactions if this became widely known? Abolitionists would cite it as proof that enslaved people are being kept ignorant deliberately. Slavery advocates would be furious that someone tried to undermine the system from within. It's politically impossible to address. So the case was quietly closed. The house in Austin County was sold through the same proxy system that had acquired it, the new owners never learning its history. The children scattered across Texas remained where they'd been sold, their French gradually fading as they were forced to learn English to survive. Beckett tried to follow up with some of the children over the following months, curious about what became of them. The results were heartbreaking. The boy Thomas, who'd provided the name Monsieur Laurent, was working in the cotton fields of a plantation in Waller County. He'd learned enough English to follow basic commands, but had grown sullen and withdrawn. The French that had once flowed so elegantly from his lips was rarely heard. His owner considered him a disappointment, not worth the price that had been paid. The girl Louise had been sold twice more after her initial purchase, each owner frustrated by her continuing difficulties with English and her apparent stubbornness. She'd ended up in a household in San Antonio, working in the kitchen under a woman who spoke some French and had been more patient. But even there, Louise had lost most of the refinement that had once characterized her speech. The educated girl who'd memorized French poetry had been gradually erased, replaced by someone who used language purely functionally, stripped of the beauty she'd once commanded. The others followed similar trajectories. Their education became a burden rather than an asset, something to be suppressed and forgotten rather than cultivated. Within a few years, most had lost much of their French fluency, the language skills fading like a half-remembered dream. In his own quiet moments, Beckett wrestled with profound questions about what he'd uncovered. The French abolitionists had genuinely believed they were fighting injustice, demonstrating human equality through education. But they'd treated the children as means to an end rather than as individuals deserving of consideration. They'd given these children something precious, knowledge, culture, intellectual development, then abandoned them to circumstances where those gifts became liabilities. Was it better to have been educated and then forced to forget, or never to have known what you might become? Beckett had no answer. The children themselves seemed divided. Some spoke of their time at the French house with something like nostalgia, remembering it as a period when they were treated as students rather than property. Others seemed angry, as though the education had been a cruel joke that made their current circumstances harder to bear. Judge Morton, who'd been instrumental in the early investigation, expressed it this way. They tried to prove these children could learn, but all they proved was that knowledge without freedom is its own kind of torture. The legal documentation from the case was filed away in courthouse archives, unlikely to ever be reviewed. Officially, the matter was resolved. But Beckett couldn't let it go entirely. In the summer of 1854, he wrote letters to several abolitionist organizations in the North, describing what he'd discovered. He thought perhaps they might use the information to support their cause, to demonstrate both the capacity of enslaved people to learn and the cruelty of denying them that opportunity. The responses were mixed. Some organizations were interested, seeing potential in the story. Others were troubled by the ethical implications, uncomfortable with citing an example where education had been used so cynically. A few suspected Beckett of creating an elaborate hoax, unable to believe that such a systematic operation could have existed without becoming widely known. Ultimately, the story of the French-speaking children of Texas never became the powerful demonstration its creators had hoped for. It remained a footnote, a strange historical curiosity that occasionally surfaced in letters and private correspondence, but never coalesced into a broader movement for change. By 1856, Beckett had moved on to other investigations, other cases that demanded his attention. Texas was growing rapidly, and with that growth came new crimes, new mysteries. But he never entirely forgot the children who'd spoken such perfect French. In 1857, he learned that André Beaufort, the Houston lawyer who'd managed the operation, had died in New Orleans. Among his effects was found a manuscript, a detailed defense of the French House Project, arguing passionately for its moral necessity, despite its controversial methods. We could not free them, Beaufort had written in what appeared to be intended as a published pamphlet. The law, society, the entire structure of Southern civilization prevented us from offering these children actual freedom. But we could give them knowledge, prove their humanity through their capacity to learn. We believed, I still believe, that seeds planted must eventually grow, that children educated in freedom of thought cannot be permanently enslaved in mind, even if their bodies remain in bondage. History will judge whether we were visionaries or fools. The manuscript was never published. Beaufort's family, embarrassed by his association with abolitionism, destroyed most of his papers after his death. Only fragments survived, preserved by a sympathetic colleague who recognized their historical significance. Laurent, the schoolmaster, vanished more completely. Ship records suggested he'd returned to France in late 1853, but his trail disappeared after that. Whether he continued teaching, whether he ever spoke of his years in Texas, whether he maintained any interest in the children he'd educated, none of this could be determined from the fragmented records that survived. The children themselves aged into adulthood, their childhood education becoming an increasingly distant memory. Some retained fragments of French throughout their lives, occasional phrases or words that surfaced unexpectedly. Others lost it entirely, the language replaced completely by the English they needed to survive. A few of the children Beckett had interviewed eventually gained their freedom through various means: purchase by sympathetic owners, escape via underground railroad networks, emancipation during the Civil War. Whether their early French education played any role in their paths to freedom was impossible to determine. The connections, if they existed, were too subtle and personal to document. Beckett retired from law enforcement in 1859, shortly before Texas seceded from the Union and plunged into the Civil War. In his final months as sheriff, he wrote a private account of the French House investigation, sealing it with instructions that it not be opened until after his death. That account, discovered by his descendants decades later, provided the most complete record of the operation that existed. In it, Beckett wrestled one final time with the moral questions the case had raised. I have spent my career enforcing laws, believing that justice exists within legal structures. But this case challenged that belief. What was done to these children was legal, but unjust. Their education was both a gift and a cruelty, an act of compassion that served the educators' ideals more than the children's welfare. I cannot condemn the intent. Opposing slavery is righteous. But I must condemn the method, using children as instruments of political philosophy without concern for their individual well-being. The children paid the price for their educators' idealism. They were given knowledge they could not use, taught to see themselves as capable of intellectual achievement while trapped in circumstances that denied them any opportunity to exercise those capabilities. They became living contradictions, proof of human potential and of the cruelty of denying it. I do not know what became of most of them. I hope some found ways to use their early education to preserve some part of what they learned. I hope the light Laurent tried to kindle was not entirely extinguished. But I fear that for many, The French house was simply a strange interlude in a life defined by bondage. A memory that brought more pain than comfort. If this account is ever read, let it serve as a reminder that good intentions without practical wisdom can create their own forms of suffering. The fight against injustice must consider not only ideals, but also consequences, not only the cause, but also the individuals affected by our methods of pursuit. The story of Texas's French-speaking enslaved children never achieved the historical recognition its participants hoped for or feared. It remained obscure, mentioned occasionally in scholarly works on slavery in Texas, but never becoming a widely known element of American history. Some historians who encountered references to the case dismissed it as exaggerated or misunderstood, unable to believe that such a systematic and prolonged operation could have existed. Others saw in it a fascinating example of abolitionist strategy, though most acknowledged the ethical problems inherent in the approach. The children themselves, as they lived out their lives, rarely spoke of their unusual education. For most, it became simply one more strange element in lives filled with disruption and uncertainty. Some remembered the French house fondly, others with resentment, many with confusion about what it had all meant. In the decades following the Civil War and emancipation, a few former enslaved people from Texas mentioned in their narratives a period of education in French during childhood. These accounts were often met with skepticism by interviewers who assumed the memories were confused or exaggerated. The systematic nature of the operation, the organized school with its multiple teachers and carefully maintained records, seemed too elaborate to be credible. But the evidence existed, preserved in courthouse archives, in private letters, in the fragmented records of slave traders and lawyers. The French house had been real. Dozens of children had been educated there, given years of intensive instruction in language and culture, then released back into slavery. What remained unclear, perhaps unknowable, was whether it had mattered. Had the education helped any of the children in their later lives? Had their existence as educated enslaved people challenged anyone's assumptions about human capacity? Had the operation contributed, however minutely, to the eventual end of slavery? The answers varied depending on who was asked. Abolitionists who learned of the case after the Civil War tended to see it as a noble, if flawed, experiment, an attempt to demonstrate equality that was limited by its time and context. Defenders of slavery dismissed it as propaganda, insisting the children must have had some undocumented exposure to French that explained their abilities. And the children themselves, in the rare instances when they spoke of it in later years, offered the most nuanced perspectives. One man, interviewed in the 1880s as part of a project documenting the experiences of formerly enslaved people, recalled his time at the French house with mixed emotions. They taught us to read in French before we could read in English. They taught us poetry and history, treated us like we were students in a real school. For those years I felt like maybe I was worth something more than my labor. But then they sent us back, and none of it mattered anymore. I had to forget most of what I learned just to survive. So I don't know if it was kindness or cruelty, giving us that education. Maybe it was both. Another former student, a woman who'd eventually made her way to Philadelphia after emancipation, saw it differently. They taught me I could learn. That stayed with me, even after I lost most of the French. When I got my freedom, I already knew I was capable of education because I'd had it before. So I learned to read English, learned to write, learned enough to support myself. Would I have done that without those early years? Maybe. But knowing I'd done it once made me believe I could do it again. These individual testimonies, preserved in scattered archives, suggest that the impact of the French house varied enormously depending on the child's subsequent experiences and personal resilience. For some, it was a psychological resource that helped them survive and eventually thrive. For others, it was a painful memory of something given and then taken away. In 1898, nearly half a century after the investigation concluded, a historian researching slavery in Texas contacted Beckett's family, having discovered references to the French house case in old court records. Beckett had died 5 years earlier, but his son provided the sealed account his father had written. The historian spent months verifying the details, tracking down surviving documentation, even locating a few people who'd been children at the French house. The resulting scholarly article, published in 1899, provided the first comprehensive public account of the operation. Reaction was muted. By the end of the century, with slavery long abolished and Reconstruction's failures becoming apparent, the story felt like a curiosity from a distant past, rather than a revelation with contemporary relevance. It confirmed what many already believed, that slavery had been a system of profound cruelty that deformed even well-intentioned attempts to resist it. Some readers found in the story a parable about the dangers of treating people as means to ideological ends. Others saw it as evidence of the fundamental impossibility of ethical action within an evil system. A few still insisted it must have been exaggerated or misunderstood, unable to accept that abolitionists could have acted in ways that seemed so callous toward the people they claimed to be helping. The French house itself, the physical building in Austin County, changed hands multiple times over the decades. By 1900, it was a regular farmhouse, its history forgotten by current owners. No marker indicated what it had once been. The dormitories had been converted to regular rooms, the schoolrooms repurposed, the library dispersed. And across Texas, in cities and small towns, on farms and in workshops, aging men and women went about their lives carrying memories of perfect French lessons from a childhood that seemed increasingly dreamlike and improbable. Some still remembered phrases, could still conjugate verbs they no longer had occasion to use. Others had let it all go. The French fading like a language heard only once and never reinforced. A few, in their final years, spoke to children or grandchildren about the strange time they'd been taken to a school and taught like they were meant for something more than labor. Some of those stories were preserved, passed down, eventually finding their way into family histories and local archives. But mostly, the story of Texas's French-speaking enslaved children became what its creators had feared. An episode that demonstrated the capacity for education while changing nothing about the system that denied it. The children had spoken perfect French. They had proven they could learn, could master complex knowledge. And it had made no difference at all to the structure that kept them enslaved. In the end, the French house stood as a monument to the insufficiency of good intentions without practical change, to the danger of treating people as symbolic rather than as individuals with their own needs and desires. It was a story without heroes, where everyone involved, the educators, the children, the investigators, were trapped by systems larger than themselves, making choices that ranged from inspired to tragic, but ultimately changed very little. The children had spoken perfect French. They'd been raised in exactly the same way, taken young, educated intensively, returned to slavery. The pattern had been identified, investigated, and documented. And then, like so much of history, it had been filed away and largely forgotten, leaving only scattered records and fading memories to prove it had happened at all. Sheriff Beckett's final words in his sealed account perhaps captured it best. "I sought to solve a mystery, and I did. But the solution brought no justice, resolved no fundamental wrong, and left the children no better off than before. Sometimes the truth we uncover only reveals how powerless we are to change the circumstances that make such truths possible." The children spoke French. I learned why, and that knowledge changed nothing. The investigation was closed. The case was solved. And across Texas, in the years that followed, children grew up never knowing that others like them had once lived a different life, if only briefly, in a house where they were treated as students, capable of learning anything, before being returned to a world that insisted they were capable of nothing at all.